right, you ready? Okay. I'm going to call for some announcements.
Perfect.
All right, everybody, we can get started. Welcome to seminar today. Does anyone have announcements before we get started? Yeah.
Yes, please. Just for the OS 001, your seminar summaries are due on Sunday nights, right? This one is the Sunday night that you get back from spring break. And it might be easy to forget that, so I recommend that maybe you do it before you leave for spring break. And then I sent emails out to some of you that you have an amnesty for the things that are not turned in yet. So make sure you get those to me by Friday. Let me know if you have questions.
Great. Any other announcements? Okay. It is my pleasure to announce Dr. Allie Glassie today. She is a fellow ocean lover and scholar and sailor. Allie is a literary scholar specializing in hemispheric American literatures, modern and contemporary literatures, and the environmental humanities. She holds a PhD in English from the University of Virginia and a master's in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island. And she's currently a postdoctoral scholar at Harvard University. She previously held a postdoctoral position in environmental humanities at the University of Virginia. Dr. Glassie's research explores the influence of the ocean's biology, physical dynamics, and cultural histories on the literature of the Americas. To give you a sense of her current work, I would like to read a description of her book project. So, drawing on her master's in marine affairs and her experience at sea, Allie's current book project is entitled Atlantic Shapeshifters, Sea Literature's Fluid Form. It takes the comparative literature offshore. In the study of 20th and 21st century fiction and drama in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, shape-shifting beings. Okay. So, Allie's current project is entitled Atlantic Shapeshifters, Sea Literature's Fluid Form, and it takes comparative literature offshore. In the study of 20th and 21st century fiction and drama in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, shape-shifting beings, including seal-human silkies, sea creaturely mariners, and sea deities of the African diaspora, embody marginalized ways of encountering the ocean. By centering the maritime experiences represented by these gender and species fluid, often racialized figures, Atlantic Shapeshifters shows how identity shapes human relationships with the ocean and offers a more inclusive tradition of sea literature, one that helps us imagine just, multi-species futures on a climate-changed ocean planet on which we are at once castaways and shipmates. Allie's writing appears in novel, a forum on fiction, interdisciplinary studies in literature and the environment, Coriolis, Blue Water Sailing, Bioscience, and SX Salon, a literary platform of the Caribbean Studies journal, Small Axe. So, Allie, thank you so much for joining us today. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to present your talk, Feminism and Fisheries, Literary Perspectives from the Northwest Atlantic.
Thanks, everyone. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Cool. This is great. Hopefully my glasses are not going to fog up. They probably will, but here we are. So first off, Carrie, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really glad to be able to be here at MMA today, and especially glad to be able to be here in person. And I'm really wanted to thank you and Professor Friedman for including me in the seminar series and for everything you've done to organize the talk. And I also just want to take a minute to thank all of you for being here today. I'm really excited to be here and think with you all because I get to think about questions that have been on my mind since at least 2006, when the crew of Brilliant, on which I was then working, we named each of our sales for literary characters and assembled a poetry library in the salon. And these same questions led me to grad school, first in marine affairs and then in English. And along the way, I was told that grad school is where good sailors go to die, but that's another story. And then one last thing before I get started. I might be up here at the lectern, but I can promise you that I have a lot to learn from all of you. And so please chime in. The goal here is for our time together to help us all develop fresh perspectives on things that might be really familiar to us. So, ask questions, interact, ask for clarification. We'll be covering a lot of ground. Also, just wanted to let you know, since we will be talking about matters of gender and equity, there may be some sensitive material. So just if you need to take a minute, that's totally fine. All right. So without further ado, here we go. Whoa. All right. Okay. All right. Now we also need to. Oh, okay. Hold it lower down. Great. Done that. Okay. Great. And now the clicker doesn't seem to be working either. All right. So here we go. So these are some of the big research questions that I think about a lot. Oh, thank you. All right, so we're going to start out by thinking, right, the ocean is known through imagination as well as through direct experience, right? So the next questions that I have are, well, whose experiences are we talking about? How does the ocean shape the stories we tell? And then where are women and their voices on working waterfronts? And the answer, which I hope you can ascertain from these pictures here, is literally everywhere, right? Ad campaigns, stereotypes, and classic works of literature might suggest otherwise, but women are and have always been central to the history and culture of fisheries. And so some of the images that you see speak to that centrality in all sorts of scales, right? From the spiritual, that's the statue on top of Our Lady of Good Voyage, to the deeply material, right? This is a picture of barrow women in Newfoundland. And then even to the ways that we talk about vessels, right? Even the name you may have heard, Mother Carey's chickens, right? They're storm petrels. That's derived from the Latin Mater Caritas, which is a term for the Virgin Mary. I'm a little bit off script here, but we'll get back on track. But what I wanted to sort of offer here, right, is that even though all of this labor is central to what the umbrella of activities that we think about as fisheries, as shorelines get gentrified, built, and rebuilt, and as sea level rise intensifies, the spaces historically occupied by women get erased and written over, like quite literally, right? So the contributions that women have made, if they're preserved at all, they remain largely invisible. And so, actually, I think it might be better if I just advance slides. Right. So, despite the fact that women comprise nearly half the global and fisheries and aquaculture workforce, and despite the fact that here in Maine, women have been central and major pioneers in fisheries and aquaculture, the narrative, right? The narrative that strictly defines fisheries as men on boats rather than that wide range of activities that I just mentioned persists, right? And so here's two quotes that kind of speak to that contradiction that I want to get at. The divide between sea and shore, writes Valerie Burton, is a gender binary with more substance than many. And then Amanda Moser, who is, and she works in aquaculture, she says, when I see a boat, in my mind, I see a family, right? And so here's where, as a literary scholar, I get super excited. Narratives are sort of my stock in trade. And so my immediate question is, what would a more inclusive narrative look like, and how can I help create one? And how does storytelling from and about coastal communities care theorize the contributions of women and families to fisheries past and present. And then, kind of following from that, how does gender intersect with questions of maritime labor, occupational identity, and environmental change? So in today's talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use poems, novels, plays, short stories to help us think about these questions. And in doing so, I want to make the broad case that because literature of the sea brings actual experiences with the ocean into our imaginations, it can help us think more expansively about questions we might more usually consider from a scientific or a policy perspective. I also want to suggest that the Northwest Atlantic is both a large marine ecosystem and a literary region. You may have encountered in high school, like British lit or American lit. I pretty much guarantee you haven't encountered Northwest Atlantic lit, but I'm going to introduce that to you today. I'm also going to suggest that its literary history and its marine environmental histories are intertwined, and that gender is an essential part of understanding both. So we'll start with a poem by Cheryl Savageau, a poet of Abenaki and French-Canadian descent who lives in Massachusetts. From there, oh, perfect. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Right, okay, so we'll start with a poem by Cheryl Savageau, a poet of Abenaki and French-Canadian heritage who lives in Massachusetts. And from there, we're going to move to a novel that some of you may have heard about, Captains Courageous, by Rudyard Kipling, which was published in 1897 and looks back on an 1860s fishery. And then we'll wrap up with two contemporary works, Donna Morrissey's Sylvanus Now, and which follows a fishing family in 1950s Newfoundland, and Carlisle Brown's 2016 play, Finding Fish, which is set in the near future on a dystopian Maine coast and was the result of a commission to write a play on the sustainabilities of fisheries. And so as we think together about these artworks, we're going to consider how gender influences our relationships to the ocean and also how the ocean itself has been gendered. So again, feel free to stop me, ask questions along the way. And here we go. Advance the slide here. Okay, so here's Cheryl Savageau's poem, The Grand Banks. And I'm going to read this to you. And what I want you to do as I read it is to notice something about the poem that sticks out to you. This could be a line, a word, an image, or your reaction. So here we go. From the ocean's depths, from the dark place, rising up from the seafloor, this great underwater plateau, this dinner for fish, this underwater banquet, this feasting place where haddock and cod gather like buffalo, their numbers too great to imagine. The currents hit the slopes, feeding nutrients from sea bottom, the water rich with plankton, algae, and diatomic life. Whales come from the warm waters of the south to raise their young here, where food is plentiful, filling the waters with songs that can be heard for 1,000 miles more. Ocean is their word for world. All right. Does anybody want to maybe toss out something that they noticed? Silence is totally okay, but I wonder if anybody may notice something they want to bring out here. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, what stuck out to you about that?
Not really true anymore, unfortunately.
Exactly, right. Not really true anymore. This was written in 2006, right? So definitely written when that's not true. So why do you think a writer today would sort of choose to take that approach, right? Of writing something that isn't really true anymore? And this is open to anybody. Maybe something to keep in our minds, right, as we move along. And so what we have here is a writer writing from a present in which numbers too great to imagine are no longer the case, but what she's doing is she's creating a poem that kind of mirrors the topography of the banks, right? It's rising up from the seafloor. It looks like it, just on the page. And she's really thinking about the conditions that created these numbers too great to imagine. One of the things that's interesting here also is this idea that she's talking about cod gathering like buffalo, right? This is an indigenous writer who is likening cod and buffalo, right? So thinking about the buffalo that has been synonymous with indigenous dispossession in the west of the United States, and kind of using a lot of that imagery and symbolism and applying it to cod, right? So that's also something we want to be mindful of and significant and keep in our minds. So upwelling's bringing nutrients up from these depths. It's creating these conditions for this primary productivity that has been decimated, right? And this is what attracts fishers from Europe, some of whom went on to colonize the east coast of North America. And I want to bring this to your attention because this is where the literary history of the North Atlantic, at least for those of us who only speak European settler languages, begin, right? When this moment of contact. In contrast to the Caribbean, where early European voyagers were sort of flabbergasted by an abundance of mythical seeming animals, plants, and people, and they were literally trying to write their way through the fact that they couldn't believe what they were seeing. 16th and 17th century sailors in the Northwest Atlantic were flabbergasted by something else. What was notable in early colonial writings in this part of the world was actually the unusual abundance of familiar species, right? So, for instance, marine environmental historian Jeff Bolster writes, what English sailors called the Newfoundland was surrounded by a familiar sort of sea, albeit one swarming with fish. And this sort of bonanza that ensued, it really overlapped with and sort of literally fed the colonial and imperial and racial violences that continue to shape our world. So in the American Revolution, enslaved people on Jamaican plantations died of famine because shipments of salt cod from the fractious colonies further north did not arrive. And today, salt cod features in culinary traditions of the Caribbean, Northeast Brazil, and West Africa. And now, as your classmate mentioned, right, this productivity is, even though this is a matter of biophysical conditions, the numbers are no longer too great to imagine. And so, another thing that I want to bring to your attention about this poem is this next slide here. Oh man, totally skipped a slide. This one. So at the end of the poem, we have these whales, right? And one of the things I think this last line of the poem is doing, ocean is their word for world, is it's framing the Grand Banks as biologically productive and a place of cultural formation, right? For whales as well as for people, as I just described. So for the whales, this marine ecosystem is a nursery. It's a school where youngsters are learning the behaviors that will characterize their adult lives. And it's also a source of language and culture, right? And so this is where I kind of want to suggest to you that the ocean is a cultural and literary space for humans too, right? I also want to argue that even though, or maybe because, the seafaring world has been historically male-dominated, the ocean itself has been largely thought of as a feminized space. And in the literature of the Northwest Atlantic, the feminization of the ocean has everything to do with primary productivity and with the productivity of fisheries, which is something I want to spend a little bit more time with now. So when some thinkers, like when we think about women's relationships to the environment, often we think about the ways that gender influences scientific and ecological knowledge, access to resources, or political possibilities. Others maybe imagine a connection that is more innate or essential, right, between women and the natural world, right? This is Mother Nature. That's where that idea comes from. And that sort of innate connection is something called essentialism, and it can be a little iffy for a couple of reasons. First, because there's a long history of aligning women, children, indigenous peoples, and people of color with nature in order to justify exploiting them. And second, that construction kind of risks narrowing a gender spectrum that we know is pretty wide, right? And so what I want to do is kind of just explain like that this idea, this sort of deep, like innate connection between femininity and productivity and the natural world is kind of a faux pas. But it's important to understand because it's how the literature about the fisheries of the Northwest Atlantic operates. Productivity in the ocean is linked often to female sexuality, reproduction, and motherhood. And by the same token, fishery collapse and overfishing are often framed in terms of sexual violence and crisis of fertility. What I want to suggest here is that and what we'll discuss in the remaining time we have together is that by making meaning of a range of human experiences with the ocean, these literary texts can help us tell more inclusive stories about fisheries of the past, and also help us think about how gender intersects with questions of maritime labor, occupational identity, and environmental change in the present. And so a phrase that I like to think about here is that literature, this is a phrase from Deirdre Keneally from the Aran Islands, the social and cultural contracts of a marine life. So what I want to suggest is that by using literature to consider these social and cultural contracts, we can imagine greater equity in the world beyond the page, right? So we're going to move on now to Captains Courageous, which is made into a film, 1937, by Victor Fleming. If you haven't watched it, it features some excellent racing footage. And this is a classic story of adventure and coming of age at sea. And it tells the story of the son of a railroad and shipping tycoon who falls overboard from an ocean liner on the Grand Banks and is rescued by a fishing schooner out of Gloucester. And the story follows this child, Harvey's transition from a spoiled brat to an eager apprentice, surrounded by a crew whose tough love parenting offers a stark contrast to his fragile, hysterical mother and workaholic father. It's a story of sail training, it's a meditation on class privilege, and it's an exacting portrait of a multi-ethnic fishery in technological transition. So go read it, it's great. And so what I want to suggest here is that while the human women in Captains Courageous are flat characters at best, Harvey's mother is a caricature of a Gilded Age socialite, and the captain's wife is a kind of female embodiment of Gloucester. Femininity and maternity are everywhere in the cod fishery, especially in terms of the vessels. Harvey falls overboard, a low gray mother wave carries him away from the propeller toward his rescuer's dory, making a psychological transformation possible. And then on the slide here, I have a little bit of a taste of the way that the vessels in the novel are described. The first quote refers to Marblehead heel tapper, which is a sort of antiquated type of schooner by the time the novel had been written, and then a bark from Saint-Malo that we're here encounters on the banks. Anybody notice anything about these two, like what's going on in these two passages? Silence is totally okay too. All right. Well, one of the things that's interesting is that the barks and the schooners, they're all compared to women, right? They're also really full of personality. So all of the personality that we don't see with the actual characters gets sort of transposed onto the vessels. And this is bigger, I think, than the convention of using female pronouns for vessels. I think it's actually one of the ways that this novel helps us imagine a range of relationships to the ocean and to the fishery. So this is a coming-of-age novel, right? This is a novel about the transition from childhood to young adulthood. And so these novels feature oftentimes scenes of education and scenes of budding intimacy. And the schooners actually fill these roles in the novel. So as he spends more time at sea, Harvey becomes more familiar, right, one might say intimate, with the flirtatious schooner that you see being described in this passage, right? And then at the same time, he's learning from shipmates that one might describe as deeply familial and even maternal manners, housekeeping, and professional skills, right? And so one of the things that this novel is doing is it's separating biological maternity from parenting, education, and discipline. Activities that in the 1890s would have been widely understood as women's work. Even though by keeping actual men and women apart, it's upholding that hard gender binary that we talked about earlier. It's taking two feminized spaces, the home and the classroom, and it is taking them to sea. And so one of the things that I see that it's doing, it's taking some of the unseen work of women in fishing families ashore and making it visible at sea. And this is counterintuitive and like super weirdly socially progressive for a novel by Rudyard Kipling. Ecologically, though, neither Captains Courageous nor Kipling say very much. There's an offhanded comment in the novel about fish running fewer and smaller, and then another in Kipling's autobiography about a happily married lady codfish laying 3 million eggs at one confinement, which is a Victorian term for childbirth. But Kipling is really more concerned with the social world than the impact of the fishery on marine ecosystems. So with that thought in mind, we're going to move super quickly on to a novel that takes place in the 1950s. And this is a novel called Sylvanus Now. So it's written in 2005 by Donna Morrissey, who grew up in an outport called the Beaches on Newfoundland's northwest coast. And this novel is pairing the intimacy with the environmental. So it's setting the fertility crisis of a mismatched young couple against a 1950s fishery that's undergoing profound transition. And you can see this in the images here. So just in terms of super brief historical context, does anybody want to volunteer like how ocean space was thought about in terms of governance at this particular moment in history in the 1950s? No? Cool. So at this point in history, something that's important to keep in mind for the way that the novel thinks is that coastal states maintain territorial seas of 3 miles, and the 12-mile territorial sea and the 200-mile EEZ that we know today hadn't come into effect yet. So in the novel, these large factory freezer ships are occupying the same space as the inshore fishermen like Morrissey's characters, right? So they're literally putting these very disparate forms of technology on top of each other in the novel in order to illustrate kind of this transition. And so what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a flavor of how this novel can contribute to a discussion about feminism and fisheries. First of all, it's deeply attentive to local knowledge, that of its author and its characters. And it constantly is positioning this ecological knowledge in relationship with gender. So here's one passage that shows you what I mean. Anybody see a word or maybe a term that sticks out that maybe they haven't seen before? No. Totally, silence is totally okay. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting here, right? We have half out of the water, its belly is creamy as milk. There's reverence, the word reverently the Sylvanus is unhooking the jigger, right? So we have this one passage with the mother fish being reverently released back into the ocean, and then another, which is long, which I'll read just a little bit of, but here, this is where the main character, right, he watches a net rupture and spill redfish all over the ocean, right? And so the term motherfish, right, is being used in both passages, one in a moment of intimacy and reverence, and the other where the same character who's been releasing these motherfish, which is a Newfoundland term for an old, large female fish whose fecundity meant that they were better left in the ocean to breed, right? He's witnessing this vessel just like this waste of all these motherfish, right? And so at the very end of this passage, right, he's talking about unlived life into the sea, her weakening, seeing in the mother's fate his own, right? It's pretty wrenching language. And it's really, like, it makes us remember that the novel's author grew up in an output like the one she's writing about. And she's imagining this world. She's using the experiences of people she knows, and she's using local terminology, right, this term motherfish, right, to contrast a respectful, traditional, small-scale approach with that of the modern factory ship, right? So she's using the language and imagery of motherhood to present fishing families and communities as ecological stewards. And then subsequently in the novel, by contrasting her character's ecological knowledge to radio broadcasts in which government representatives are saying, we're trying to reassure, and they're saying a bit too soon to be calling it overfishing, and sit back, vast as the sky is the ocean, more plentiful than the stars are her fish. She's illustrating a situation in which certain types of ecological knowledge are valued more highly than others. And this goes on. This goes on and on in the novel, which is also applied to the ocean. And I know I'm mindful that that our time together is short, but one of the things that I want to just suggest to you about these passages, right, is that we have a range here, right? We have this constant, even though there are various moods here, we've got rocking, we've got this sort of coddling maternity, we've got something much darker, right? That the ocean is always depicted as a mother, despite a range of sea conditions. And one of the things that's interesting here is that we move from this sort of like friendly, kind of sensual image, right, to a concluding quote where there's nervousness, right? There is reluctance. And it's a little uncomfortable. And we get the sense that if the ocean were a person in that final passage, that she probably wouldn't consent to what's happening. This reluctant to yield to his jiggers, right? There's an overtone of sexual violence here. And we also get the sense, in the novel will later tell us that its characters don't feel super comfortable either, but also that they don't have a whole lot of power over the situation. And so by this point in the novel, right, like if this is a point in the novel where the fisheries depleted and Sylvanus's wife, Adelaide, has struggled through 3 difficult and ultimately unsuccessful pregnancies. And one of the things that Morrissey is doing by aligning the ocean that is sort of constantly presented as maternal with a human woman who is struggling to have a child is to show us that a scientifically and politically complex problem can be as intimate and emotionally challenging as a couple's efforts to have a healthy child. She's also using sort of a lack of agency and a sense of powerlessness in face of both problems to link a human, like this crisis of fertility that's going on like in the humans but also in the ocean, to crises of masculinity that fisheries sociologists like Nicole Girard-Power and Donnelly Davis document in the wake of Canada's 1992 closure of the cod fishery. which Morrissey is writing in the wake of, right? So returning to the idea that sea literature is helping us make meaning out of our experiences with the ocean, with Sylvanus Now, we're really thinking about how deeply intimate experiences offer a way to think about much larger scales of technological, environmental, and social change. And I know I went through that fast, but I will send this around as a handout so that you can all refer to it. All right. So we've been offshore in the 19th century schooner fishery of Captains Courageous, and inshore in Sylvanus Now's 1950s Newfoundland. And we're going to bring it home in the time we have left to a near future Maine coast with Carlisle Brown's 2016 play, Finding Fish. And you can see a shot from the production and the playbill here. And this is a post-aquacalyptic world, right? And I'm borrowing that pun from marine biologist Daniel Pauly. And so we've got sulfuric rain falling over a superheated ocean. Coastal cities like Boston and Miami are submerged, and vast mats of algae and swarms of jellyfish are overwhelming vessel traffic. Nobody is catching anything, okay? So that's the backdrop for this play. The one person who is catching something is one of the play's characters, Peter Morgan, who operates a sailing trawler with his wife, Fiona. And their operation supports a whole community. Family drama ensues when Michael, a marine biologist, is sent by the government from New Boston, remember the original Boston is underwater, to investigate his highlining brother's success. So the spoiler alert here is that this success has everything to do with Fiona, who you see kind of in the foreground of the stage in that picture there. And she's a woman who speaks in single words, prepares only coffee and seaweed stew, and has a predilection for nude swimming. And so before I continue with the story, can anybody guess why Fiona might be so good at finding fish? Why this particular character? Is that a hand over there? No? Okay, here's another question. Do the attributes that I just described, right? Like single words or not speaking at all, not a great cook, but preparing only. Yeah, I see a hand. She is not a mermaid, but that's an awesome guess, right? She's a selkie, right? So she's a mythical shapeshifter, seal human shapeshifter that's able to kind of shimmy out of its skin and pass among humans. And one of the things that's really interesting about selkies is that they surface in the folklore of the North Atlantic from the eastern seaboards of the US and Canada to the coasts of Great Britain, France, and Spain. And so the geographic range of these stories overlaps with the range of the harbor seal and with the gray seal. And this is really interesting. Scholars of folklore describe selkie stories as migratory legends, right? And these legends are types of stories that change based on the time and place in which they've been told. But they retain certain key features wherever they show up. And they've actually been mapped. So one of these features is the selkie's enchanted skin, right? If a human steals a selkie's skin while the creature is in human form, the selkie, who's often a woman, is compelled to follow her usually male captor ashore, and where they later get married, right? And however companionable their relationship might be, if the selkie manages to recover her skin, she will immediately return to the sea, even if it means leaving human children behind. And so in coastal communities in Ireland, some scholars suggest that selkie stories were used to explain issues like maternal abandonment or congenital mental illness, and also to come to terms with maritime risk. They were also politicized, and so most notably for our purposes, J.M. Singh, who is a playwright and folklorist working in Kerry and the Aran Islands at the turn of the 20th century, uses a selkie story to comment on gear and vessel access in the mackerel fishery. At a time when the British Empire was policing traditional boats like curraghs to force formerly independent fishermen into wage labor, right? So this story gets politicized. And so in finding fish, Peter has hidden Fiona's skin in a sail bag, and they fish well together, right? This is an instance of seal-human cooperation in waters where, until the 1950s, bounties on seals persisted because seals were understood to compete with humans for fish. But although they seem to care for each other, right, I want to underscore that their relationship is not consensual, right? So building on our conversation about how storytelling from and about coastal communities can help us recover women's contributions to fisheries, and building on the matters of ecological knowledge we discussed with Sylvanus now, and with matters of consent that I just introduced, I want to just give you a brief sketch of how finding fish, which renders the climate crisis and fishing down food webs into dramatic form and puts a Selkie on stage but doesn't let her speak, helps us think about gender, equity, and fisheries in the present. And so the fact that Fiona is physically present on stage, right, she's always on stage, or almost always on stage, signals the central and ongoing participation of women in fisheries and aquaculture. And when she reclaims her skin and goes back to the ocean at the end of the play, Peter's business falls apart. But the fact that she is relatively silent throughout the play, the men are literally talking over her, means that her experience and vast ecological knowledge is being marginalized, right? So it's not, she's not speaking, she's not part of these scientific or policy conversations, right? And this tension, right, between physical presence, like her body is literally on stage, but audible silence, right? Like Kate Olson's observation that she seldom hears female voices on working waterfronts should start us asking questions, right? So with the questions we're thinking about, this is my last slide, how do we include all kinds of women, right? How do we promote and sustain access? How do we value all kinds of participation and knowledge, right? Not just that narrow slice of, you know, the sort of traditional narrative, right? The men on the boats. And then also the fact that Fiona is a Selkie, right? She's a shape-shifting figure who embodies human matters of consent and sexual coercion, and ecological matters like competition for prey, should also make us think about safe spaces for women, right, who face discrimination or threats of gender-based violence in male-dominated spaces, and how also to think about managing fisheries and aquaculture for healthy overall ecosystems, right, for humans and animals, right? So she has there's a lot behind her, right? And as I conclude, the answers to these questions are matters of ongoing debate, as you all well know, right? And so my role as a scholar of literature and culture is to show that how they're part and parcel of the stories we tell in an effort to make meaning of our experiences with the ocean. And so I want to invite you to keep pondering this material and ponder these questions as you continue in your time here and you think about your professional trajectories beyond MMA. What I hope is that our time together has helped illustrate the intersectionality of gender, maritime labor, occupational identity, and environmental change, and has also shown how cultural products like poems, plays, and novels can show how feminism and fisheries might not be as far apart as maybe we thought before we walked in this room. And at the very least, I hope this talk has given you some reading ideas. I would be happy to share reading lists and happy to take questions. Thanks. I see one over here. Hi. Hey.
Sorry, I don't know why that was so squeaky. Anyways, I'm just curious, why are Selkies often portrayed as women and not men, considering like the whole will talk. I just thought that was kind of an interesting point you brought up.
Yeah, so there are stories about selkies that are male. Like the kind of consent issue tends to work the opposite way in those stories, where like the male selkie will come ashore and like kidnap a human woman. But most of the time they're women, and I think that has to do what colleagues who work more closely with this material have told me is that it has to do with the ways that sort of rural life functioned in these small communities all around the Atlantic Rim, right? Where women who they would marry into their husband's family and leave their own family behind, and it would often be a source of real like discomfort, right? And often they were not going into these marriages consentingly. So when we get back to that idea of the migratory legend, a lot of these stories, when folklorists started going around and collecting them, they kind of noticed this pattern where these women who were telling these stories had these kind of histories to their own experiences that informed that. So that's a quick answer, but I can certainly suggest other, like if you want to delve in, I can send you more material. Yeah.
So a lot of what you talked about was like very old. How would you say that everything you presented kind of like applies to women in like the marine field and fisheries today?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So I think one of the things that I try to do is look exactly as you say, right? Look to old material to think about what can it do to speak to us today. And this is where I think that, to get back to the questions that are on the board, right? Like, one of the things that I think the literature that I talked about does really well is kind of show how gender shows up in fisheries history. But as I mentioned, it's not always super inclusive of a wide range of women and female identifying people today. So I think one of the things that we think about when we're trying to think about how history informs the present is like, how can we capture the widest possible set of experiences and draw lessons from them? And so that's why I go back as far as I do, to not only capture a wide set of experiences, but also to understand the ways that what is going on in the literature is reflecting larger structural issues that we're still dealing with today, that are behind, right, some of the questions or the sort of points that I end up with at the end. Thank you. That's a really helpful question.
Hello.
Hey.
I was kind of wondering, so you mentioned how in these old stories and even today, the ocean and all the vessels and everything are kind of shown as a female character.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is so important if like true female voices were never heard in those stories, like human voices?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, well, to use Captain's Courage as an example, right? One of the things that novel is coming out of a culture in which the language of femininity and gender was everywhere. When you look at the writings about 19th century schooners and even the ways that they were talking about particular spars and particular pieces of gear, like the gender discourses are everywhere. I think that, to get back to your question, is like, one of the things that I think is important about this literature is that it shows us kind of how fluid that boundary is, right? That we think, like when we think about these narratives, right, of fisheries, of maritime labor, like in the popular imagination, that gender binary is very hard. But it was actually a lot more fluid, not in the sense that there were physical women present, but that, again, right, it's about making a broader narrative, right? And so that's why I think, to get back to your question, that's why, like, you know, it's, these stories are not, they're kind of showing what happens when you take women, like women's work, right? Like raising a kid, like a spoiled brat of a kid, and putting it at sea. So you're making the women's work visible. I mean, it's deeply problematic, right? Like, this is a novel that would probably be canceled today. But it's still interested in these questions, and I think part of it is, like, we as 21st century readers have a different vocabulary with which to interact with it. But I also think it's an issue of, like, Kipling, he was a reporter, so he had a very good ear for kind of the way that people were talking about certain things. He's trying to filter, like, the fact that this social world that he's documenting actually has women in all of these different roles, but he's not, like, he's trying to figure out a way to capture that maybe is imperfect. Does that help? Okay.
So we're out of time, but let's give Dr. Glassie a round of applause.
And thank you. I will put my, well, yeah, I mean, Professor Whitaker and Professor Friedman have my email, so if there are other questions that come up, I would certainly be happy to correspond about them or to be in touch in other ways.